Uh, it's just 2 o'clock, so why don't we get started? Good afternoon and welcome everyone. This is Jim Rooney. I'm President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and on behalf of the Chamber and all our members, please accept our best wishes for good health during this challenging time. I know that we're all going through different experiences and levels of stress, and I hope everyone is doing well and bearing up. The Chamber exists to make Greater Boston the best place for all businesses and all people to thrive, and that purpose certainly does not put on pause during a crisis like this. It means that we're working on behalf of the business community to understand and work to address the most pressing issues facing our region, and none of them is more important now than the response to COVID-19. That's why we're here today in a very important discussion about the coronavirus, its impact on the business community, and how business can respond and help flatten the curve. We're lucky to have a renowned life sciences and medical sector in Greater Boston, making incredible advances that are helping not only here at home in this region, but nationally and globally. Which brings me to our partner in today's program, Dr. Rajeev Venkayya of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Venkayya is president of the Global Vaccine Business Unit at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, where he leads a vertically integrated business developing vaccines for norovirus, dengue, and Zika. Currently, Dr. Venkayya is co-leading Takeda's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Prior to Takeda, Dr. Venkayya served as Director of Vaccine Delivery at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health Program, working on their 2 top priorities, polio eradication, introducing new vaccines into developing countries. He offers a wealth of experience and perspective, and we're very fortunate to have him with us today. Dr. Venkayya is joined today by Takeda's U.S. Head of Human Resources, Lauren Dupree. Lauren is a seasoned human resource executive and brings experience for her time at Deloitte, Biogen, GE, and currently Takeda to this conversation. Lauren will be discussing the evolution and specifics of Takeda's workplace policies and answer any employer-related questions that may come up during today's conversation. So now I'd like to turn it over to Lauren and Dr. Venkayya for today's presentation.
Thank you, Jim, and I really appreciate you inviting Lauren and I to talk with you today. This is a trying time for everyone on the line, and I know you have many things going on, and I hope that we can add some understanding and context to everything that you're having to do with your teams and in your organizations. I'm going to go through a little bit of background on the virus that we're dealing with, as well as the pandemic itself. And the strategies that you're seeing employed here in Massachusetts and frankly around the world. And then we'll talk about how our company, Takeda, has been managing our own organization through this crisis. And I wouldn't say that we have everything figured out. We have some ideas that we'd love to share, we'll enjoy sharing with you, and we'll be happy to take your questions. One thing that about my background I just want to share up front is that prior to Takeda and the Gates Foundation, I did work in the White House for 4 years as the special assistant to the president for biodefense. This is in the 2005 to 2007 timeframe, when we, as a country, were facing the outbreak of a potential pandemic virus called H5N1 influenza. And at that time, it was clear that if this virus did become a pandemic, that first of all, it would threaten a lot of people, and we would lose a lot of lives, but also that we would not have a vaccine or a treatment available for quite some time, and that communities would have to get through this without that kind of what we called countermeasure. And that is very similar to the situation that we face today. So it's with that background in planning for a pandemic, and my team wrote the national strategy for pandemic influenza. By the way, we also developed the Flatten the Curve strategy. We didn't call it the Flatten the Curve strategy. We called it Targeted Layered Containment, or TLC, and that ended up becoming federal guidance in 2007 and was updated in 2017. And today it's been given a much better name, Flattening the Curve. So we'll come back to that. If we could go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the outbreak, and this is really quite a striking illustration of every place that we've identified the virus to date, and it's a very different graph than what you would have seen just 2 weeks ago or 2 weeks before that, and that's because we're dealing with a very difficult virus. This is one that transmits very easily, more easily than the seasonal influenza virus. And it also transmits stealthily. And by that, I mean that the symptoms produced by this virus are very similar to those you would expect with a cold or the flu. And so when people have COVID-19 are infected with the virus that causes it, they don't necessarily have symptoms that are different from a normal cold or flu to know that they should be trying to get a test for this infection unless they're very ill. And in fact, that I have to say is an issue that the public health community has not conveyed very clearly. First of all, we haven't the community hasn't explained that in the absence of widespread diagnostic testing, we have probably been missing a lot of virus transmission around the world. And so in the early days of this outbreak, when you saw areas where there were not red dots, many people assumed incorrectly that the virus was not there, when in fact the virus was in Europe very early and it was in the US very early. It's just that we didn't have widespread availability of diagnostic tests to know that. And on top of that, because of the stealth phenomenon that I mentioned, people assumed that cold and flu symptoms were just that, cold and flu, if you didn't have a history of travel to an area that had the virus or contact with an individual with the virus. And so here we are in late March, and we now know that the virus is in fact everywhere. It's in communities around the globe. There are very few countries that have not yet reported cases, and if they haven't reported cases, it's just that they haven't yet tested enough. It's almost certain to be everywhere. Now, what can you do in this situation? Let's turn to the next slide, and I'll talk about the theory behind that, and then we'll talk about the actions that are being taken. So this is the flatten the curve strategy that you're hearing so much about. Let me begin with the big reddish curve and explain what the graph is showing. If you look on the vertical axis on the left, we're looking at the daily number of reported cases, and on the horizontal x-axis, so the vertical y-axis I explained, the horizontal x-axis, you can see the time since the first case, and the pink curve represents the accumulation of cases over time. Now, this is a virus that reproduces and expands exponentially, which means that in this case, every 6 days, you have twice the number of individuals with infection that you had before the start of those 6 days. And so that's what we call doubling time. Over the course of a month, if you don't intervene with public health measures, you could have 30 times as many people infected as you had at the start of the month. So the curve shows that exponential rise in cases that you'll see. Now, if you have an uninterrupted pandemic, then over time, you'll develop some level of protection in the population that we call immunity. And once a large portion of the population is immune to the virus, then it burns out. The wave comes to an end because there aren't enough susceptible people around for the virus to be transmitted. The problem with this is that the rush of cases of illness that you have in a community in a pandemic where everybody is susceptible because it's a brand new virus can completely outstrip the capacity of the healthcare system, meaning our hospitals, our clinics, our nurses, physicians, everything that it takes to provide a certain standard of care is exceeded by that rapid rise in cases. And that's the dotted line that you see there. When we talk about the community mitigation or flattening the curve strategies, These are things like closing schools, canceling large public gatherings, uh, employing social distancing techniques, and then very importantly, ensuring that anybody who's sick stays at home and doesn't circulate in the community. That has three major impacts. First of all, it delays the peak of the outbreak. So that greatest stress that you can expect on your health system is delayed, which buys time for your health and medical systems and public health authorities to plan and put the resources in place so that you're ready for the surge. Now, of course, this is in theory. This is assuming that people are working during that time to do that planning. Secondly, it reduces the height of the peak. This is very important because if you can limit the difference between the the demand on the health system, meaning the height of that peak, and the supply or the capacity in the system, then that is a smaller number of people that are not going to be able to get the care that they deserve. And actually, what ends up happening in that situation is that it's not just the people above the curve that aren't getting good care, it's everybody under the curve that's not getting the standard of care that we want. And what I mean by that is that if you're in a hospital that is overrun with individuals that need care because of COVID, then the physicians and nurses are going to be splitting their time between that group of patients and everyone else that needs medical care, whether it be for childbirth or for a heart attack or appendicitis, you name it. And so the average standard of care for everybody suffers. And when we talk about this outbreak, people often talk about it impacting older adults and individuals that are at high risk. And that is true on an individual basis, that your risk is greater based on your age and whether you have underlying medical conditions. But when it comes to hospital care, everybody's at risk. And that's another reason why we all need to care about what's happening in our health and medical systems if we don't mitigate this outbreak. The final objective of this strategy is that you reduce the total area under that curve, meaning that you limit the total number of people that contract the virus. And that is a good thing because you're limiting the number of people that get sick and by extension require hospitalization and some small portion that will die. So these are the goals of the strategy, and none of them require vaccine. None of them require therapeutics. These are all what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions. Now, the challenge that we're currently facing in many parts of the U.S. is that we are playing catch up, and by that I mean that we now know. Well, I actually many of us recognized this a long time ago, but there has been virus circulating in this country for probably 2 months. In fact, almost certainly 2 months. Yet we've not been behaving that way in communities and as a country until very recently. And so a number of doubling periods have occurred, meaning that the virus has spread quite broadly and infected a lot of people before we began to take action. Now, in that context, you have to, I'm going to use the term bring a hammer down because that somebody else who wrote an essay recently talked about it this way, that you take extreme steps to try to put the brakes on the outbreak. And this means that you're not just canceling schools and discouraging public gatherings. It means that in this case, we're asking everybody to stay at home, shelter in place, as some would call it. When we originally conceived the flattening the curve strategy, and just so it's clear, it was not me personally that came up with the original idea. It was a couple of people on my team, but we then built it out together. When we first conceived of this, we never envisioned the extraordinary measures that would be necessary or that would be taken to stop the virus in its tracks, or at least attempt to do that, because we recognized that a good community mitigation strategy would be employed early. So even before you have significant numbers of cases in a community, that you're testing for cases and that you have early recognition and that you act quickly. And if you act quickly, you don't have to impose such severe measures. Because we're quite far along in the spread of the virus, it's necessary to take these significant measures. Now, our hope, or the hope of policymakers and public health officials is that we will be able to arrest the majority of new infections, but we will not see that for at least a few weeks. That's how long it's going to take for the infections that we stop today to manifest in a drop in the curve in cases that are being identified, appearing in hospitals, and appearing in ICUs. And this brings me to a very important issue, which is laboratory testing. In order for public health officials to do what is necessary to quickly respond to an outbreak, they need to have access to diagnostic tests. And ideally, those diagnostic tests would be rapid, broadly available, and they would be used in a way that is not just focused on people that have a risk of exposure, but when you're looking for community spread, that you're using these tests, at least some of them, to see if the virus is appearing in places that you don't expect it, meaning in the general community. Because if you find the virus circulating in the general population, you're in a very different situation than if you're just finding the virus in individuals that have, for example, traveled from another country. And so the reality is that in this country, we didn't actually have a chance of containing this virus because there wasn't widespread availability of testing, unfortunately. The analogy that I'm using is it's like asking a pole vaulter to compete, but just before the competition, you take away her pole, and you're asking her to compete anyway. I mean, that's how significant a challenge it is for public health officials to control an outbreak of this nature without having diagnostic testing. Now, the good news is that testing is now becoming available, although not everywhere and not as available as we'd like in many cases, but that will get fixed over time. And that's very important because it's going to be important to have widespread availability of testing, in my view, to begin lifting some of these interventions. The most severe interventions we may be able to lift sooner than when we have widespread testing ability, but to really peel back the majority of measures, you want to be able to detect cases very quickly and then do contact tracing and quarantining of individuals so they don't propagate transmission, or I should say return of the virus in the community. The last point that I want to make, and by the way, I'm happy to take any questions about this after Lauren presents the other side of this story, I just want to talk a bit about public communication, because this is I think a very difficult set of messages to give to the general public. On one hand, the reality is that if a person does not have risk factors like their age group or underlying medical conditions, in all likelihood, if they contract this virus, they will have mild illness. 80% of people will have mild illness. It's a small portion that will require hospitalization and a very small portion that will need to be in the ICU or don't survive this illness. So that is a reassuring message for most people, not all people, because there are a lot of people that do have underlying medical conditions. And for those of you that run organizations, you can't look at somebody and just because they're young, quote unquote young, or that assume that they are not high risk. These underlying medical conditions are not necessarily things that people talk about, and so we all need to remember that whenever we're discussing what's appropriate in terms of an individual employee's behavior. So on one hand, we're telling people that you should not be nervous if you don't have underlying risk factors. On the other hand, we're imposing these very severe measures in communities, and the average person has cognitive dissonance. You're telling me I'm going to be okay if I get this, but at the same time, you're telling me I shouldn't leave the house, which is a very scary thing to tell somebody and a very scary thing to hear. And so we have to find a way, all of us, to convey that these two things can coexist. It can be, this is not an illness that will be severe for most people. And it's important for you to stay home because we're trying to protect the healthcare delivery system so that everyone in the community that needs that hospital, whether they have coronavirus or something else, will have a system that is appropriately staffed with healthy healthcare workers prepared to provide the standard of care that we expect. This is something that we're going to continue to have to work on, but But I'd like all of you to take that as one of the key messages here that we need to convey to all of our people to make sure that they don't panic as these measures are imposed, but also are very smart about their own personal behavior and don't contribute to a problem that they can't even see. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my colleague Lauren Dupre and have Lauren tell you a little bit about how we at Takeda have approached this challenge.
Lauren, before you begin, could I just remind people on the call that there's a Q&A feature that you can use to submit questions. We'll see them, and I'll pass them along to either Dr. Venkayya or Lauren at the end of the presentation. But please take a look at your screen, and you'll see a choice that says Ask. Make sure it's set on all panelists. So use the Q&A feature and select all panelists. Thank you. Lauren?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Rajeev, for that great overview. So hi, everyone. As Jim introduced, I'm the head of HR for our U.S. business unit as well as our U.S. People Advisory Group. And what I wanted to start with doing is sharing a little bit about our workforce at Takeda, and then frame up how we are responding as a company, as an employer, to support our employees through this, to support the communities that we're working in, and all the while ensuring that we're delivering the very important medicines that we do make and develop for our patients. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so Takeda, some of you may be more familiar with Takeda than others, but we're a global biopharmaceutical company. We are headquartered in Tokyo. We have 50,000 employees worldwide. We're operating in 80 different countries, and we have a very significant presence in the U.S., but specifically in Boston. Boston is one of our global hubs. We're listed now on the New York Stock Exchange, and the U.S. represents also a significant portion of our overall revenue as a company. So 50% of our revenue comes from the U.S. This global presence that we have, though, has enabled us, I think, to have a really great view of what's been happening in the global landscape as COVID-19 has unfolded. And we're also able to take lessons learned from various countries that have faced this issue before we have in the U.S. and been able to adapt those to our U.S. workforce as we've done in the past few months. If you go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit more about our specific presence in the U.S. So in the U.S., we do have a large presence and really across the entire country. We do have employees in, I think, nearly every single state in the U.S. We have 18,000 employees across multiple different business units. So Rajeev is our head of vaccines business unit. We have presence in oncology. We have a significant R&D presence, manufacturing, as well as plasma-derived products, which are really dispersed across the entire country. So we have a very large and diverse workforce in the U.S. And as we've thought about how we can support these individuals through such a time, we've had to think in that way. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of how we support them, how we ensure, too, that we're able to keep our business running, keep our employees safe, and most importantly, continue to deliver for patients. So with that, we really thought through a set of principles about how to approach this from an employee perspective, thinking through how we want to show up for employees, recognizing that this situation is incredibly fluid, it's moving incredibly fast, and that we will need to adapt quickly as it moves along. So with that, really a set of principles around communicating openly and transparently, knowing that we won't always have all of the answers, but wanting to keep our employees globally, and specifically also in the U.S., informed about what we're doing. If you go to the next slide, I can share with you a timeline of really how this has unfolded at Takeda. Again, some of the more major events that you've seen developing globally, and that's on the top there are those kind of major COVID events globally in blue, and what Takeda has done in the red there. So at the end of January, we kicked off at Takeda a global crisis management committee. As Rajeev was introduced, he is co-leading that with another executive team member who oversees our public affairs function here. And they kicked that team off with representatives from HR, EH&S, communications, as well as a range of other important internal functions to ensure that we were coordinating our response globally and really monitoring this as it would unfold. So that kicked off at this point, 2 months ago. We very quickly then enacted travel guidance prohibiting all non-essential travel to China, which then just about a week later evolved into a February 9th updated travel guidance where we strongly discouraged all non-essential international travel for the following 4 weeks. So that applied internationally to all of our offices. And as you can imagine, that was not a decision that Takeda took lightly. We do have a large amount of international travel, and updating that was something that certainly required all of our leaders, all of our employees to adapt to, but was incredibly important. You can see that then evolved even further, just about a little over 2 weeks later, requiring TET approval, which is our executive team, that's our most senior leadership team, approval to travel to any of the level 3 countries. Level 2 countries would also have additional health and security precautions. And then we really also asked our employees that if they were taking personal travel, that they register with an internal service that we provide that ensures that their trip is safe and that they're getting breaking information should the situation unfold. And as you can see from this timeline, as I think as we're experiencing all day to day, you wake up and it's just you're not so sure what's going to unfold in any given day. And we wanted to ensure that our employees were not only protected in what they were doing in a professional capacity for our Takeda, but that we were also offering those resources to them to protect them also personally to the extent that they were endeavoring in travel there. And then our most broad guidance just came out a couple weeks ago, March 8th, and that is when we asked all of our employees to work from home, to telework when possible. So if their job and their personal situation at home allows for it, to work from home. We asked that all non-essential international and domestic travel be postponed or canceled, anything other than a private vehicle, and we extended that through May 31st. We also discouraged any large gatherings through that same time period and advised that we limited meetings to 10 people or less and that you maintain that social distance measure, the 6 feet between people that I think we're all becoming more increasingly familiar with. So we communicated this out to all of our employees just a couple of weeks ago, and even since then, we've found ourselves in a very evolving situation. So since March 8th, we've all seen school closures piling up. We've seen these shelter-in-place or stay-at-home advisories, as we just saw Governor Baker enact, but we've seen in other states prior to this as well. And that's required us to really adapt how we're supporting our workforce. And so as I mentioned, we've really been thinking through a set of principles that we're looking through in all of this and communicating open and transparently, but also providing flexibility and as much support as we possibly can. With that, though, one of the things that we have been doing is seeking wherever possible to leverage existing platforms, existing programs that we already have as an employer and adapting them to this new situation. That enables us to respond quickly. It also enables us, I think, to convey to our employees that we are ready. We have the tools that we need. We may just need to ramp them up or use them in a different way. And I think that really can be a steadying force. A recent, I believe it was a Gallup poll, showed that the majority of people in the U.S. are really looking to their employer as a trusted source of information. And so as much as possible conveying that, we do have this under control, we know how to handle these things, and we are on top of it. I think that's been very reassuring to employees. And then we are seeking to always be engaging very regularly in two-way dialogue internally and externally. So whether it be panels like this, or holding regular town halls and two-way dialogues with all manner of employees at our company. And then, I'll wrap up too with sharing some of the specific ways that we've sought to support our workforce. So we've taken a four-pronged approach to supporting some of these workforce disruptions that we're seeing. So first is we have enhanced our paid sick leave policy to provide an additional 10 days paid for all employees in the U.S. to use for purposes relating to COVID-19. So that may mean an employee's own diagnosis of COVID-19. It may mean that they're having to self-quarantine because a family member or other close contact has been diagnosed and that their job requires them to be in person, and so therefore they need the paid time. Or it may be due to a school closure or other child care disruption that they're seeing. So we rolled out these additional 10 days late last week. So that's the first approach, is providing additional leave. The second part of the four-part strategy is expanding access to backup childcare. And of course, this is something that we're seeing evolve regularly as well. But we opened up our service through Bright Horizons and Care.com in terms of their network of finding individual backup care providers. We opened that up to all of our employees in the U.S. and are ensuring that they have access to that service and are aware of how to use it if that's an appropriate solution for them. The third is really looking at our flexible working arrangements and encouraging managers and employees to discuss if those are something that might make sense for them now. So that might mean adapting an employee's schedule. Perhaps now might be a time where they could work 4 10-hour days instead of a traditional 5-day-a-week schedule. We've really just sought to educate people about that. And again, those are things we already have, but really thinking about, can we leverage those in a way now to support some of the challenges we're facing now? And then finally, the fourth part of the strategy is really giving guidance, tools, training, and support measures, including employee assistance programs, access to telehealth, training on how to best work from home and engage a virtual workforce. And so we recognize that, the strategy is something that is working really well for us now, and we're keeping our eye on how we might evolve things as we move forward. New challenges will come up, and we're really aiming to just stay connected to our workforce, and as I mentioned, staying connected externally as well. And so with that, I'll hand over to Jim and the panel if there's any questions that Rajeev or I might be able to answer.
Well, thank you, Lauren. That was a very thorough and well-organized approach to managing communications. I have some questions, and once again, we'll take questions. Hello,
Jim. Sorry, it's Rajeev. Can I just wrap up with a couple of quick points, and then we
sure.
can
Then ask some questions. Sure.
Sorry about that, and thanks, Lauren, for that summary. So just two quick things, and it's around what else Takeda is doing to support the global and local pandemic response. First, with regard to developing treatments for COVID-19, we have one of the largest plasma therapy businesses in the world, and we are so we have a lot of products that we use for people with life-threatening conditions that are derived from plasma, and we're developing a new product that is an antibody preparation that is made from plasma from donors that have recovered from coronavirus infections. They have high levels of antibodies, which are part of the immune response to the infection. It can take weeks for these antibodies to really build up, and so they aren't necessarily there for you at the beginning of an infection. We're preparing a solution of those antibodies to give to people that are at high risk for having severe outcomes from COVID infection. We estimate that it'll take 9 to 18 months to actually get a licensed product and make it widely available. The second set of activities are local, and they are looking for ways that we can support the community in preparing for and responding to this pandemic. We have a great interest in doing what we can to support the healthcare workforce. This is a precious resource in every community, everywhere in the world. They're putting themselves in a high-risk environment, which is potentially being made even more high risk because there isn't adequate personal protective equipment like masks available to be used as it should be in these settings. And so what we have told our employees is that if you know a person who takes care of patients, whether it's a nurse or a technician or a physician, and you can, that you should think about ways that you could potentially support them by offering help with childcare or making meals if they're spending extra time in the hospital, or even helping to take care of them or their family members if they happen to become ill. And I would say that one enterprise that helps along these lines that the Chamber has encouraged its members to support is the Life Sciences Emergency Supply Hub Coalition, which does exactly that. So I'd encourage all of you to consider supporting them or any other groups in the area that are helping to keep our healthcare workforce healthy and supported. So with that, Jim, now I'm
Great.
done, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, actually, I want to follow up on treatment and vaccine. I know that, I mean, we already spoke about Massachusetts being a life sciences hub, and I believe Takeda is the biggest drug maker by head count in the state. So can you expand on it? I mean, when we watch the news, we hear about different companies that are pursuing some form of treatment or vaccine. I think I saw there was about 70 different efforts underway, not just around Greater Boston, but across the country. Can you talk about what the collaboration that exist or different bio and pharma companies sort of approaching this from different angles? And you mentioned that timing issue. I think you said could be up to 18 months for the work you're doing. You know, we hear a lot of different news about the timing with which these things could be made available.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So first of all, I've been really excited to see the response of the biotech and big pharma enterprises that are already making medicines, but are turning their capabilities and expertise toward this problem. Everybody sees it as an emergency. Everyone recognizes that just about everyone's lives have been or will be touched by this virus, and that we have a collective responsibility to do everything in our power to bring tools to healthcare providers and patients and public health officials to deal with this situation. And by the way, that this is a problem that is global. And as we develop these products, we have to have a plan to make sure that people around the world have access to them. So I think that that's been really positive. There's also been very strong collaboration across companies to leverage clinical trial consortia so that you can conduct evaluations very, very quickly. In terms of the actual product development, there are a few categories you can think about here. On the treatment side, there are a lot of drugs that are already licensed and have been shown to be safe and effective that could be repurposed for this virus, particularly antiviral compounds that are now being tested in clinical trials. That I would say is the fastest way to get a new product into the mix. But I would caution everybody that there are a lot of promises that are out there and a lot of anecdotes. We really need to wait for high quality data showing that a product works against this virus before physicians can use it. Otherwise, these products should only be used in the context of a clinical trial. Then there are treatments that are kind of on the shelf in companies that are not yet licensed but could be quickly evaluated. And one group that's been created is called the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator, supported by the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust and MasterCard. And that's an example of a consortium that is trying to bring in these products and quickly evaluate them. And these are, I would say, in the repurposing category, these are the data could be available for the product to be repurposed within months. For the new products that have not been yet been licensed, you're talking about a longer time frame, perhaps 4 to 6 months or more. In the case of vaccines, the Tony Fauci from the NIH has said expect at least 12 to 18 months before we have a vaccine available for broad use. That would be the fastest vaccine development timeline in history if we can achieve that. I can tell you that the regulators and everyone are trying to remove any administrative bottlenecks, but there are just some very important assessments of safety and efficacy that where you can't compromise that have to be conducted before you launch a vaccine for wide-scale use. But that's the time frame that we're targeting.
Thank you for the clarity of that explanation. My follow-up was going to be about the again what we all see in the news about existing licensed drug like the malaria drug that is getting a lot of attention. Do you have any insights into that particular repurposing?
Just that we don't have enough data to say that it should be used outside of a clinical trial.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned your experience at the White House, and you've been through other forms of outbreaks, H1N1, Zika, SARS. How's COVID-19 similar? How's it different?
Well, in other cases, we with the exception of H1N1, we didn't have a pandemic. The thing that we've always worried about is that you have a virus that is easily transmissible between humans and causes a substantial portion of individuals who get infected to die. And the seasonal flu, on average, kills about 1 in 1,000 people across the population in a country like the US. The mortality associated with this virus is probably, it appears to be much higher than that. And we're not exactly sure how much higher than that. It could be 5 times, 10 times higher, possibly more. And so this is what really concerns people, is that this has actually become a pandemic. It's gone everywhere. But unlike the H1N1 virus, which also went everywhere, you have a much higher lethality. So that's what I would say is really concerning.
Couple questions about the curve. You presented the curve and gave as good an explanation as I've heard about it. When do we? Those are of course sort of theoretical curves that you presented. When do we start to see some tracking of the curve in terms of which direction we're actually heading in?
That's a great question, and it gives me a chance to confirm that the curves that we talk about are based on disease modeling, and disease modeling is not a prediction of the future. It's simply a compass. It gives you a sense as to what type of impact you could have with different interventions, but the reality is almost certain to be different somehow. I think the collection of real-time data on the measures that are being imposed in other places is really, really important, so that we can update our models with real-time information. What gives me a lot of encouragement is that in places like Singapore, they've been able to keep this, apparently have been able to keep this outbreak under control without, for example, having to close schools. They've kept the schools open, but they've done schools differently. They've implemented social distancing measures in the schools, and they've had the ability to take a more, I won't call it a relaxed approach, but certainly compared to what you're seeing in some communities in the US, more relaxed, because they started early. Starting early makes all the difference when you're talking about a disease that expands exponentially. So my hope is that we'll continue to refine these models in terms of the real life feedback on, when it's okay to start relaxing things and whether we should expect a rebound. That really is going to come down to having widespread availability of diagnostic testing.
Yeah. You in your remarks, you talked about the initial strategy. I think you used the phrase "bringing down the hammer." Something of a blunt reaction, a lot of restrictions and interventions, and you've emphasized the need for testing and data, which I think is important. So when do we move from this sort of bringing down the hammer to a targeted strategy? What do public health officials and those in decision-making roles, what do they need to know before they start relaxing and getting to a much more targeted strategy?
Yeah. Well, let me first acknowledge that a lot of pain is being caused by these measures, and everyone is feeling it, but the people that are feeling it most are the hourly wage earners, for example, who just don't have many options, and they can only be without a salary for not very long, and I suspect in most cases. And so this is where community support for each other is really, really important. I think that there are measures that we have a reasonable degree of confidence are going to be important, like cancellation of public gatherings. That it's pretty clear that that's going to reduce transmission. School closures, if There is significant transmission happening in schools, and at this point, we don't have evidence that that is not happening, and it certainly is an issue in influenza. So I think it's reasonable to do the school closure. Those kinds of things, I would say, are a little more straightforward. The closing of the casual contact, environments like retail outlets and restaurants, there I'm not so sure. And this is just me speaking personally. I'm not a disease modeler, and I'm not saying that this is something you should tell everybody is the case, because I don't know for sure. But there I do think we have an opportunity to look carefully at, can we do things differently in these establishments that allows them to reopen, and what would the right timing for that be? My hope is that we could find a way to do this before months pass, because this wave of the pandemic could last many weeks. It could last a couple of months. It could go into the summer. That's possible. So we're going to need to find a way to right size these interventions so that we can get society moving again, get the economy moving again, get resources into people's pockets so that they can support their families. I think that's very important, and it's what you're hearing from many policymakers, that we need to find a middle ground here. But we also have to be a little humble when it comes to this virus, because we have seen that in certain countries, when you've lifted the restrictions where they had been successful, that you're seeing in some cases disease transmission return. Now, some of that is because it's being imported from other countries, but there's probably some that's happening because you're kind of creating an environment that's more supportive of virus transmission in communities. So the analogy I would use is, we slammed on the brakes on the car, and we're going to take our foot off the brake a little bit, and we need to have good ways to measure what the impact is on virus transmission in the community. The best one is going to be diagnostic testing, and then if it looks like we relax too much, then we put it back down. And we need to have that. The public needs to understand that we're figuring this out together. Then they're going to need to be comfortable with this kind of taking your foot off a little bit, but then putting it back down if you need to.
Yeah. Along those lines, a question about returning to work. You mentioned social gatherings and perhaps retail, thinking about different approaches. What about other work environments in terms of, when could we begin to think about taking our foot off the brake a little bit there? Is it tied to, again, to testing data, and could people, for example, that have already recovered or already been tested, could they be allowed to return to work?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. I look, the decision on these things is going to be up to the elected leaders on when to do this. But if there is a permissive environment that's something other than shelter in place, then businesses can look at changing the way the workplace functions, so that you accomplish your social distancing objectives, your facility cleaning objectives, that you create a safer environment. Now, we need to do this today for certain employees that need to come into a facility. So in our company, we have people that are on the manufacturing line. We have people that are collecting plasma. We have people working in laboratories. And I can tell you that we have structured those environments to make them as safe as we can for employees. You can never make the risk zero. I think everyone understands and accepts that, but there are simple things you can do to significantly reduce risk, and we are doing that. My hope is that we'll be able to do this broadly across the office environment as well, so that business will be able to operate in something closer to business as usual, but it'll be business a little bit unusual, because we'll have ways of working that reduce the likelihood of infection transmission.
Right. Rajeev, I have a couple more for you, but I do want to, in the remaining time, make sure I ask some questions that have been posed to Lauren. Lauren, you mentioned as part of your four-part strategy, childcare. Given the recent restrictions on childcare, how are you accomplishing that?
Yeah, and absolutely, and that's one of the things that we're seeing, right? The environment is changing so rapidly. So, as I mentioned, we do have employee presence in in most, I actually think almost all of the states in the U.S. So some states have not had such restrictions, and so opening that up for all of our employees in the U.S. was really important. The networks that we're tapping into, though, through these providers also do have access to individual care providers, and it's not just child care. They also are other forms of care that we know employees might need. And of course, we count on everyone to always follow state and local guidance first and foremost, and evaluate, whether these practices are safe for them. But as Rajeev alluded to as well, many of our workers do fall into that bucket of really essential workforce and will need access to childcare in order to continue manufacturing and delivering these medicines. And so they might need that childcare. But yes, it is about rapidly evolving, particularly in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Another question is around employee communications, particularly given your sort of global presence. And footnote, I love the phrase you use, the employer, establishing the employer as a trusted source of information. Have you established regular communication times and the issuance of information electronically or virtual meetings? Have you established regular schedules for those kinds of things?
We have not, and Rajeev can correct me if I'm missing anything, but we really have not established any sort of, count on this broad thing coming at this exact time, and that's because things have been changing and adapting, and so we are communicating kind of when we need to, and sometimes that might be a matter of a day or two later from a previous communication. What I can tell you that we've done that has been very effective is really a layered approach to communication. So we will have broad global communications. In fact, one just came out last night for our workforce globally. But then we will layer in national communications, so things that will go out to the entire U.S., but also site level and very specific, more local communication. So, for example, with the Massachusetts, the governor's recent order, we did do just a communication just for our Massachusetts-based employees.
Okay.
We found that really helpful. And then also what we've done is, with the workforce of our size, 18,000 employees, we can't expect a couple people to be everything to everyone. And so we've made a very concerted effort to make sure that our HR community, our EH&S, which is Employee Health and Safety community, and other leaders are really empowered with the information they need. And so what we have done in terms of a regular cadence is we have an extended team in the U.S., an extended U.S. crisis management team that includes representatives from each of our largest sites, as well as representatives from each of our kind of large functions. And we do meet, it's daily. We've had days where we've canceled and not met that day, but for the most part, we've been meeting daily to get those leaders the information they need that they can then cascade out. And it does also work in that two-way dialogue. So they are raising issues, ideas, and challenges as they come up as well.
Okay. Rajeev, a couple of final questions for you, and they relate to data. You mentioned the public health numbers. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but public health numbers perhaps tracking the reality that is out there in terms of the amount of transmission that has taken place. So I guess a two-part question. One is, how should we interpret the public numbers in terms of confirmed cases, given that we need to get more testing out there? And the second part of the question is, how does that availability or lack of availability of reliable data affect the curve? I mean, as we begin to track it, could the numbers be catching up with reality, so to speak?
Yeah. So So those are great questions. Part of the rapid rise in the numbers here in the U.S. is because diagnostics are catching up with the cases. So it's not all due to day-to-day expansion in numbers, but there is certain to be significant day-to-day expansion of this outbreak at this point. Although hopefully it's slowing with these measures that are being taken in cities. I think we have many more cases in this country that are being reflected in the testing. Mark Lipsitch from Harvard had a great op-ed in the Washington Post this morning about diagnostic testing, and he's saying it could be 10 times the number of cases that we've currently accumulated. I personally think it could be much more than that. So I actually don't view the case numbers to be very helpful. Unfortunately, the death numbers at this point probably are accurate, because if anybody is dying in an ICU of respiratory failure, that appears to be due to an infection, they're probably getting tested for coronavirus, because that testing is being prioritized. And so you can do a back calculation, an estimate for every individual who unfortunately passes away from this illness. About 1 to 200 individuals were likely infected, and that's just the simple math of a case fatality rate of between 0.5 and 1%.
Okay. And one final question. What's the most recent understanding on the human ability for immunity buildup and reinfection threat?
It's an evolving area of science. It's been shown that you can isolate virus, or have what we call virus shedding, from previously infected individuals for weeks after their symptoms have resolved. Whether they are actually infectious to other people is an unknown. Tony Fauci does think, based on his decades of experience, that if you've been infected with this virus once, you're likely to be immune, at least for some period of time, to getting reinfected, which is really good news for all of us. My hope is that we'll eventually have a test that tells us whether we've been previously exposed, and so we'll have antibodies and other parts of our immune system that are prepared to deal with the virus. And if we can demonstrate that, then that helps us to know who is, say, in a healthcare setting, and this would have to be comport with privacy regulations, but who would be safer to put in an environment where you have patients with active coronavirus infection.
Great. Thank you, Rajeev. And before we close, I do want to highlight our next virtual conversation, which is coming up this Thursday, March 26th, where we'll have a conversation with Michelle Williams, who is the Dean of Harvard's Chan School of Public Health. Michelle will join us to discuss efforts to ensure the wellness of all professionals, particularly those in the healthcare sector. And I think based on Dr. Venkayya's comments about the way we need to think about the reopening of the workplace and the reopening of retail outlets, I think it's a particularly timely conversation to discuss the wellness of working people. You can all learn more about that and register at bostonchamber.com. And finally, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Dr. Venkayya, for sharing your time, your expertise, and resources with us. And a special thank you to Takeda Pharmaceuticals, not only for helping us with this meeting, but for your continued partnership as a valued member of the Chamber. And thank you all for participating, and I wish you all good health.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Signing off.